So Alexis will speak for around 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for a question and answer session after her talk. So.
Thank you. I hope it's 45 minutes. I didn't time this at all, so. Okay, can y'all hear me? I'm talking just a little bit. Okay, good evening, everyone. How are y'all? Good to hear. Pull up my notes. First of all, I want to thank the Baltimore City Historical Society for inviting me. This might be better. For inviting me to give this talk, and thank you to Village Learning Place for hosting. And perhaps most importantly, thank all of you for choosing to spend your Thursday evening with me to hear me yap about something that is pretty endearing to me, right? I hope you have a pleasant time listening and learning as much as I did researching this information for this presentation. So as Deb introduced, my name is Alexis Cathcart. I'm a lot of things, but for the purpose of this moment, I'm an activist, a historian, a writer, a scholar, and I'm a third-year PhD student at Morgan. My dissertation, and my research interests kind of broadly lie within the intersections of politics, labor, and race. But more specifically, I examine Black Southern migrants, as myself, I'm from Alabama, and their engagement with radical politics in the 20th century, especially those who are self-identified as communists. But for this presentation, I'm coming to you as an outsider. I'm from Alabama. I've been in Baltimore for about 3 years. And as much as it wasn't a culture shock, because Baltimore is still technically a southern city, despite the fact that when I moved here, I was very much against the fact that Baltimore is a southern city. You don't get more southern than Mobile, Alabama, really. But Baltimore is a southern city, and I've got an affinity for Baltimore and the fact that it is a working class city. It's a city full of workers, and that is immediately perceptible when you come into the city. The tall buildings, the industry, but definitely the working people and the heart and soul that is in Baltimore. So hopefully that shines through this presentation. I certainly think it does. But this talk that I have for y'all today, I'm gonna hold this up, I'm a little blonde. This talk examines the profound moments in Baltimore's history where Black and white workers overcame, even if momentarily, the manufactured division of race and collectively struggle for better working conditions, wages, and for some, a complete reorganization of society. So beginning in the mid-19th century and ending in the 1950s, I explore how Black and white workers built and struggled to maintain interracial labor solidarity across nearly a century of industrial and political change. So from the Black Hawkers and the Cooperatives of Reconstruction to radical dock workers, communists, and CIO unionists in the mid-20th century, Baltimore's working class repeatedly tested the limits of unity under racial capitalism. And what I mean by racial capitalism is the concept that racism and capitalism are not separate systems. They are fundamentally intertwined and mutually dependent upon one another. It's not that capitalism's here, racism's here, they're all mixed into one another and they function from one another. Capitalism requires inequality to function, and racism serves as a primary tool to justify and solidify that inequality through systems like slavery, colonialism, and segregated labor, which is the crux of this talk that I give today. So the talk that I give today is called Smash the Color Line, Interracial Working-Class Solidarity in 19th and 20th century Baltimore. It goes outside of, it's Baltimore City, Baltimore County. I know there's a difference, but it kind of blurs those lines for the most part. A lot of things are called Baltimore that may be Baltimore County, maybe Baltimore City, but bear with me. But for the most part, material struggles forged alliances that challenge racial segregation and class inequality. Ultimately, Baltimore's story reveals both the possibilities and fragility of interracial class unity, offering lessons for contemporary movements seeking to organize across racial and economic divides. So as much as this talk is about moments when workers were able to overcome the color line, even if briefly, it is also about missed opportunities that we can learn from in our organizing today. Right? Everybody all set? Ready to go?
Yeah.
Cool. So first of all, before we move on, I have some just pictures of Baltimore within this presentation. Most of it is pictures. Some of it are newspaper articles, so if you can't read them, don't fret. I'm just a historian, and I have to show you the primary sources that I use to do this presentation. But this is a picture of Baltimore in 1925. This is from the Maryland Center for History and Culture. It shows automobiles, horse-drawn wagons, a ship, an auction mart, the Keystone Electric Company. It shows a hotel on Pratt Street, a tobacco company, the American Oil Company, and the skyline to the east. Why I chose this picture? I just like it. And I like to see different pictures of Baltimore change over time. This is a really old city, and it changes so swiftly. So pictures really demonstrate how the city itself has moved through time physically and socially, politically, all the things, right? Ooh. Cool. So this wouldn't be a proper Baltimore presentation on labor if I did not quote Frederick Douglass. So I have a quote from Frederick Douglass that I truly think is really the foundation of this presentation and the work that I do. You can't see. There's power in numbers and in union because the many are more than the few. Again, I chose this quote because it perfectly encapsulates the sentiment of this talk and my work generally. Let this quote kind of sit with you throughout this talk, and even as you leave and you go back to your neighborhoods and your workplaces, and to understand that there's more power in the people rather than the people in power, which I think is Douglas's sentiment in this quote. So again, I'm a historian, so I have to give context for the story that I'm going to tell. So I begin our story, again, like I said, Baltimore is a super old city, so I can't go all the way back. I can't even give you everything in this time period, but I can give you a little bit about Baltimore from the mid-19th century, right? The 1830s to be exact. So since I've lived here, I've come to understand Baltimore as America in a miniature. Others have labeled it Industrial America in a microcosm. But for all of its atypicalness, Baltimore has a very distinct history, especially when it comes to labor. If you can't see this picture, this is a view from Baltimore looking northeast from the steeple of the First Presbyterian Church in Mance, located at the corner of West Madison Street and Park Avenues from 1864. So between 1830 and the Civil War, extraordinary changes spread through Baltimore's landscape, changes that we cannot get into because of time, but trust me, there were a lot of things going on in Baltimore during this period. But in the years after the War of 1812, Baltimore became a bustling, thriving port, a boom town because of its proximity to the West, and with a diverse labor pool in which employers readily exploited both enslaved and free wage laborers to achieve the highest profits possible. So Baltimore's port and its industries like shipbuilding, canning, textiles, flour milling, ironworking, et cetera, shaped the landscape and transformed Baltimore into a major industrial hub. Likewise, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the nation's oldest railroad, was running in 1830 and cemented Baltimore's status as a transportation hub. It gave producers in the Midwest and Appalachia access to the city's port. So the railroad's first year would have coincided with a spike in immigration. So the port's intake of foreigners doubled in 1830 and again in 1832 from 2,000 to 4,000 to 8,000 per year. So by 1830, Baltimore's population had grown to over 80,000 people. Fast forward about 30 years or so to the end of the Civil War, which was a significant marker of Maryland's industrial might. In 1860, the Federal Census reported a total of 3,000 manufacturing establishments in the state with a labor force of 29,000. In 1890, the number of establishments was 7,485, and the average number of workers was 98,000. So the labor demand in force would continue to grow in the years following the Civil War. So Baltimore, posed as it was or is between the North and the South, allowed for unique uses of labor. So Baltimore's entrepreneurs saw new opportunities in an expanding labor pool that included American-born whites, European immigrants, free people of color, and enslaved African Americans. In the 19th century, Baltimore was the second highest immigration hub on the East Coast. German, Irish, Jewish, and Italian immigrants moved to Baltimore and each played a varying role in shaping the city. Indeed, by 1860, roughly 1/4 of the population claimed German descent. Now this image is one that's a little bit ahead of where we are right now. It's an image from 1904. But these are immigrants arriving at Locust Point, Pier 8, and the B&O Railroad connection. This is to show the groups of people who are coming to Baltimore at this time that are shaping how the city, and particularly labor, is functioning. But at the same time, these immigrants were arriving from overseas. So too were Black folks moving into Baltimore from rural Maryland, free Black folks, along with enslaved Black people who were hired out by their masters. Now, hiring out was a labor practice that allowed enslavers to generate income from surplus labor without selling their property permanently. So it supported these industries such as tobacco, manufacturing, ironworks, and the construction of railroads and canals. So a famous example that we have of this hiring out process would be Frederick Douglass. Right. So Baltimore was unusual among cities of the time in that its population of free Black people was twice that of enslaved workers who toiled in the city. So on the eve of the Civil War, Baltimore would have the largest free Black population in the nation. And this situation, again, was a direct consequence of Maryland's location on the literal border between slavery and freedom, Maryland's liberalization of the manumission laws, and the late 18th century shift by many Maryland farmers from tobacco to less labor-intensive cereal crops. So in other words, slavery was becoming less profitable. Still profitable, but less for these planters in rural Maryland. So this is where the hiring practice that I just talked about comes in. So Marylanders also adopted this institutional term slavery, where the enslaved person and his or her owner would agree that a certain amount of time or at a certain age, the enslaved person would be freed. And this agreement was both legally binding and transferable. All of this contributing to the growing population of Black people in Baltimore. So during the 19th century, Baltimore's African-American population rivaled New Orleans. Its free Black population was comparable to Philly, and the city's enslaved population was proportionate to the nearest southern city, which was Richmond. So this boom economy that I spoke about in the previous slide was dependent upon the exploitation of multiple inequalities that intersected along race, class, and gender lines, but overall disproportionately affected African Americans, both enslaved and free. Yet the mobilization of manual labor in Baltimore did not conform to the same logic that upheld white supremacy in the slaveholding city. White skin did not protect some men from certain forms of labor. So this meant that Blacks and whites would end up working together alongside each other in some of the same industrial settings. But segregation shaped every job and union, but yet this unique labor situation and shared material conditions are what breed kind of the circumstance for workers to build cross-racial contact and even organize. So the name of this slide is Tension and Dependence, and what I mean by that is that Black people were already in Baltimore before immigrants would arrive in flux into the city. And at one point, Black people could find work with relative ease prior to these influxes. And this chart kind of shows what happens in Baltimore with more immigration into the city. And this chart comes from an article titled Problems of Negro Labor in the 1850s by M. Ray Della. If you can see at the top, it's from the Maryland Historical Magazine. but it shows this tension and dependence that I speak of. Because as Black people are losing jobs to immigrants, they're also working alongside them. So this chart shows the occupation of Black people in Baltimore in 1850 and in 1860. And what it also shows is a difference as more immigration or as more immigrants are making their way into Baltimore City and looking for work. So certain jobs you see there's a plus, that means more people join this occupation, but in others you see a minus, which are people leaving the occupation for whatever reason. But some of them have a larger number than others. So laborers, if y'all can't see, I kind of can't see either. Laborers are minus 228, right? So a lot of these Irish, Italian immigrants are coming into the city, and they're taking these laboring jobs from that Black workers who would have been free and or enslaved. Another large one here that has a minus is sawyers, seamstresses, shoemakers, shoekeepers, a lot of skilled or semi-skilled labor that Black workers were doing end up going into the hands of immigrants who are coming into the city, which is causing this tension between African Americans and just immigrants, Italians, Irish, Jewish, Germans, all of these immigrants who are coming into the city. This tension is arising from job competition. However, there is a dependence there as well, because as more immigrants are coming into the city, more people are working near each other who would have not had anything in common, right? And they would have been of varying races, ethnicities, cultures, and this allowed, again, the possibility for cross-racial contact and perhaps the ability to organize. Now, I don't want to overemphasize how much workers overcame this color line, right? More often than not, they didn't. And there are scholars that explain why. And again, I'm a historian. This is like a historiography of some sort. An explanation of other scholars who would have talked about this topic and came to their own conclusions, right? So David Roediger, hopefully I'm saying his name right, argues that the white working class in the U.S. developed its identity through race as much as class. Rather than uniting with Black workers, white laborers embraced whiteness as a form of compensation, right? So despite sharing the same material conditions of Black workers, psychological and social benefits like status, citizenship, superiority were what white workers received instead of material gains. So white workers actively distanced themselves from Black workers to assert their identity. Racism was not just imposed from above, it was produced and reproduced within working class culture. Now, this interracial solidarity that I talk about was undermined because white workers saw racial identity as more valuable than class unity. So the next book that's very important to this is Noel Ignatieff, also I'm saying that right. He argues that Irish immigrants were not initially considered white, but became white by aligning themselves with anti-Black racism. So Irish immigrants in the 19th century occupied a racially ambiguous, oppressed position. And to gain social mobility, they participated in anti-Black violence, some of that happening in Baltimore City. So riots, workplace exclusion, et cetera, et cetera. Becoming white required rejecting solidarity with Black workers, showing how race was constructed through labor, conflict, and competition. So again, these books are showing how the white working class had a much more difficult time than Black workers engaging with each other in this labor movement that is spawning in the late 19th century. And lastly here is Philip S. Fauner. He provides a broad history showing that organized labor has largely excluded and discriminated against Black workers, though there were important exceptions, some of them I get into tonight. So many unions excluded Black workers or segregated them, leading Black workers to form independent unions or even allow themselves to be used as strike breakers due to exclusion. So some movements made genuine efforts at interracial solidarity, and Black workers were constantly fighting for inclusion and equality within labor movements. Overall, these books and many others, and myself, show that the history of American labor is deeply shaped by racial exclusion, but also by persistent Black-led efforts to build interracial working-class solidarity, which leads us into our next section, which is called Hawkers and Ironworkers. And this is largely thematic and chronological as well, but some of it's a little out of whack, so just bear with me. So racial exclusion began early in the national organized labor movement, and the National Labor Union, which we're about to get into, rejected appeals from Isaac Myers. People may have heard of Isaac Myers, a caucur from Baltimore, and Black caucus to join its union. So this set the precedent for decades of segregation. White unions either excluded Black workers or confined them to inferior status. Now, Black workers responded by forming their own organizations, such as the Colored National Labor Union, while still seeking interracial cooperation when possible. But at the national level, a unified labor movement seemed possible, but could this happen locally? So the National Labor Union, in the post-Civil War years, workers perceived a need to create a unified front to combat the rising power of organized capitalism. So one of the most important issues facing the labor movement was that of the relationship between white and Black workers. What was to be done about Negro labor, competition, or cooperation? So the National Labor Union was founded on August 20th, 1866 in Baltimore. It doesn't do much else in Baltimore, but it's founded here, so I call it Baltimore history. And it was the first attempt to create a national labor group to organize skilled and unskilled laborers, farmers, and reformers into a coalition that would pressure Congress to pass a law limiting the workday to 8 hours. They were asking for 8 hours in 1866. All right, so while the union rhetorically advocated for the unity of labor, stating that discrimination on either racial or religious grounds were harmful to all working men, this is where much of the unity stopped. So we'll see kind of throughout this presentation that rhetorically a lot of unions, political organizations will have the right language for a unified labor movement. However, their practices don't match what they're saying. So workers, once the National Labor Union decides that the organization is accepting of Black workers, these workers either express outright hostility to the issue of Black labor or a deafening indifference. Many leaders wish to avoid it if possible. Some argue in favor for Black laborers, but many wonder if the trade unions would be willing to accept Black laborers regardless of their position in the NLU. So William Silvis, who's pictured here on the screen, was one of the founders of NLU, or the National Labor Union, and he stated that there is no concealing the fact that the time will come when the Negro will take possession of the shops if we have not taken possession of the Negro. If the working men of the white race do not conciliate the Blacks, the Black vote will be cast against them. Now, his rhetoric, as shady as it sounds, should not obscure the fact that he harbored much of the same attitudes as the majority of white people at the time. He opposed Reconstruction and attacked the Freedmen's Bureau as a fraud who taxed the white laborer to feed idle Negroes in the South. So even his understanding that the unity with the Negro was absolutely necessary to the success of the whole working class, he never really accepted Black workers. He kind of saw their unity as a shotgun wedding type of event, right? But he understood that shared material conditions were at the root of their organization, and he did push for Black workers to be admitted, and Black organizations to be admitted to the National Labor Union. So the rhetorical promises that Silvis made led to Black delegates being invited to the 1869 NLU convention. And at this convention, Myers spoke of the plight of Black labor and the necessity of organizing across racial lines. If you can't see that, that's okay. Do not try to read all that. There was incredible discrimination on the Baltimore docks as immigrant white workers competed for the same jobs as Black workers. And one of those professions was caulking. Caulking is a big deal here. Maybe people have been to the Douglas Myers Maritime Museum or have heard of Myers or Douglas as caulkers. But caulking, for much of the early 19th century, free and enslaved Black Americans dominated the caulking trade, which was a skilled trade. Frederick Douglass was leased to shipyard owners as a caulker before he escaped to freedom. Caulking was not easy work. It was hot and challenging, and again, a skilled job that consisted of applying a sticky sealant to the sides of wooden ships. But these Black caulkers would be excluded from unions throughout the entire 19th century, right? But we know as early as, I think, 1838, there's some ambiguity to that. But by 1838, Black caulkers were forming their own associations. But certainly in 1868, Isaac Myers founded the Colored Caulkers Trade Union Association. And his organization was invited to the convention of the NOU in 1869, and several Black delegates went to talk about the issue of Black labor. So at this convention, he spoke eloquently for solidarity, saying that white and Black workers ought to organize together for higher wages and for a comfortable standing of living. So in this address, what I have like boxed out there, he says, "We mean in all sincerity a hearty cooperation. You cannot doubt it. Where we have had the chance, we have always demonstrated it. We carry no prejudices. We are willing to forget the wrongs of yesterday and let the dead past bury its dead." So Isaac Myers is speaking of white workers who would have resorted to violence to remove Black workers from the caulking trade on the Baltimore docks. So he goes on to mention that after the Civil War, again, white caulkers struck to exclude Black workers from shipyards. And in response to this, the Chesapeake Marine Railway and Dry Dock Company was founded. And this was a cooperative shipyard organized by Isaac Myers and others, and backed by the Black community in Baltimore and elsewhere. So they raised money, and a shipyard was purchased. Now, said Myers in this same speech that he's giving, he says that the Negro Cooperative employed a large number of workers of both races, and included some of the same white people who had previously driven colored workers out of the shipyards. Nonetheless, white unions refused to allow African Americans to join their ranks, and in response to this, Myers met with other African Americans to form what was called the National Labor Union as well, but the media put colored in front of it, so it kind of just stuck, but formed the Colored National Labor Union in 1969, with Isaac Myers being its first president. Now, this was founded in December 1869. This is actually happening in DC, which is still kind of Maryland, I suppose. And Myers, who is from Baltimore, so we're still Baltimore history, right? But this includes a few organizations that are based in Baltimore, particularly the Colored Caulkers Trade Association, the Colored Molders Union, the Colored Engineers Association, and the Colored Painters Society, all of these being housed in Baltimore. And in their opening proceedings, which is what this document here is showing, they discussed their desire for a union with white laborers because they understood that they had a common interest in shared material conditions. It was clear to Black workers that interracial solidarity would bring dignity and protection to labor. And this is an early example, or an early effort by Black workers to make interracial labor solidarity a real thing. However, the prejudice of white workers made this feat more difficult than necessary. So elsewhere in Baltimore, we have some actual moments of interracial cooperation. And one of those places is in Sparrows Point in 1890. Now, I could not find very much about this strike other than that newspaper article, which says, if you can't see, the first strike in the history of Sparrows Point occurred yesterday when 42 Hungarians employed by the Joseph R. Ford Company in unloading iron ore from the steamship Irvington quit work. They made things lively for a while and employed their full vocabulary when they found themselves defeated and discharged. An equal number of colored men took their places and the work was delayed but a short time. And this is happening in 1890 in Sparrows Point, which Sparrows Point, the steel mill starts to be constructed in 1887, right? Financed by the Pennsylvania Steel Company in partnership with Bethlehem Iron Company, later becoming Bethlehem Steel, which people may be familiar with. And the location was chosen because of the deep water port, all that good stuff, right? But while the plants themselves were not segregated, the workers and their families were placed in totally separate communities based on their race. So African American housing was often of lower quality than white housing, and they were not allowed to live in Sparrows Point, leading to the founding of the African American enclave of Turner Station, which was founded in 1888. So this is where many workers, African American workers of Bethlehem Steel would have lived, and other nearby families would have lived in this neighborhood as well. But in the 1890s, we see these 84 Hungarians and African Americans come together, and they were unsuccessful in their strike. However, they were successful in overcoming this racial divide, or this color line that would have been instituted both lawfully and traditionally at Sparrows Point. Again, very little information I can find about this. However, I still think it is a powerful moment of people realizing their material conditions, realizing that they have a common enemy, and that enemy not being each other, but the employer, or capitalism more broadly. Right? And these are just some more pictures of Sparrows Point. The picture over there is workforce at Sparrows Point in the 1890s. And we also have some black steel workers here. I could not find the year for that, but I assume it's anywhere from 1900s to about 1920s, maybe later. But to show that the steel mill had an interracial labor force. And we'll return to Sparrows Point a little bit later if we make it there, because it remains a fixture in Baltimore's labor history throughout the 20th century. But for the most part, we move into the 20th century to talk about the Wobblies and the longshoremen of Baltimore. So from about 1850 to about 1900, Baltimore's population grew from over 169,000 to over 500,000 people. So Baltimore's vibrant and diverse neighborhoods evolved to accommodate a constant influx of immigrants searching for opportunity. More than 2 million immigrants landed first in Fells Point and then in Locust Point, which was a host of some interracial strikes. And we'll get to Locust Point in just a second. But what's important here is the IWW, which is the International Workers of the World, or Wobblies. And pictured here is Ben Fletcher. He is not from Baltimore, I'm so sorry. However, he's from Philly, and he organized interracially in Philly and in Baltimore. So I include him in this story. So again, Baltimore's population swelled from over 500,000 in 1910 to over 700,000 in 1920 as unemployed rural Southerners flocked to Baltimore. Even though the numbers of workers increased by a third, labor shortages were still pervasive. And by World War I, there was no single industry which dominated in Baltimore. The city was known for producing products such as pianos, chocolates, clothing, canning, meat packing, brewing, stone cutting, anything you name it, right? Some industries drew all of their workers from one or two nationalities. City brewers, as well as furniture and piano makers, were almost always German. Poles dominated the canning and fertilizing industries, and about 70% of the city's garment workers were Jewish. But in industries with mixed workforces, ethnic workers sometimes maintain interracial solidarity, but for the most part had separate unions. But in some plants, whole sections or floors of factories might be reserved for workers of a particular nationality. However, as we continue to go through U.S. history, we see organizations and unions attempt to bring workers of all races and ethnicities into one big union, as the IWW would call it. Now, the IWW was founded in Chicago in 1905, but they called for a creation of a union that would provide the foundation for a workers' government to replace capitalist society. They're different from the NLU. The NLU was pretty reformist and advocated for electoral politics. The IWW did not see any redemption in a capitalist society. So this doctrine of a class struggle was not to become the principle of the labor movement as a whole, but the Wobblies, or the IWW, would call attention to the desperate needs of a vast number of workers who were not accepted by the trade union movement. Right? So the IWW embraced two guiding principles: fighting like the American Federation of Labor for better wages, hours, and conditions, but also promoting an eventual permanent solution to the problems of strikes, injunctions, and scabbing, which meant an end to a capitalist society. So the IWW was formed by militant unionists, socialists, anarchists, and other labor radicals who believed that the great mass of workers are exploited by and are in an economic struggle with the employing class. And they would employ a number of tactics, particularly direct action over electoral politics, to overthrow the wage system, which they believed is the most responsible for keeping workers in subjugation. And most importantly, what they advocated for was racial equality and the inclusion of Black workers into their labor unions, or into this one big union. So Ben Fletcher, who's pictured here, turned to the IWW due to the union's anti-racist and inclusive organizing model, and he helped workers in Baltimore and in Philly organize across racial lines and demand higher wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions. He was also a longshoreman. So he was known on Baltimore docks from the Local 8, the Local 8, which is a part of the IWW, and he's famous for having the most interracial union, which is active from 1913 to 1928, and this would have been in Philly. Right, so here is pictured a newspaper article from the IWW's newspaper, the Solidarity. IWW, like I said, was committed to racial equality. However, Black people did play a small role in the organization. But Ben Fletcher's Local 8 possessed the largest contingent of African Americans. And this newspaper gets at how the IWW would have been engaging with Black workers at the time. And I'll read a few lines from it. But the title is "To Colored Firemen, Sailors, Longshoremen, Cooks, Waiters, and all workers engaged in marine transportation industry in and around Norfolk, Virginia." So it says, "Wake up, colored brother, shake your chains and be a man. Don't be a slave any longer. We, white workers in your industry, are members of a union, and that has helped us a lot, and we want you in it with us. You need us and we need you. So wake up and come along with your fellow slaves, the white man, into the ranks of the Industrial Union of Marine Transport Workers." I say a bunch of other stuff, but they continue on. "Don't you think the time has come when the table should be turned, and instead of a difference of color keeping us from organizing together, that we should all unite in one big union in our industry so as to present a solid front to the bosses that have robbed and exploited both of us all of our lives?" And this was a militant example of the IWW appealing, white workers largely appealing to Black workers down the Atlantic coast in particular. So he's talking about Norfolk, Virginia, but in it he mentions Philadelphia, or the union mentions Philadelphia, Boston, Providence, and Baltimore, particularly the marine workers in Baltimore. And that brings us back to Locust Point. Right, so following the War of 1812, Locust Point was annexed to the city of Baltimore in 1816, which has transformed this into a blend of maritime, residential, business culture, right? The area developed as a center of transportation and industry from the 1840s to the 1920s, and its historical significance lies in the association with transportation, industry, and most importantly, immigration in Baltimore. So the area developed when the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad extended the line in 1845 from its Mount Clair facilities to a new coal pier being developed at Locust Point. So with all the industry that's making its way to Locust Point, this brings workers to its docks, Black and white workers alike. So in 1912 in Locust Point, some longshoremen affiliated with the IWW struck for improved wages and working conditions. Despite some tensions between Black and white workers, the union managed to actually mitigate some of those racial hostilities and many black workers joined the union. However, these tensions, or I guess this cooperation did not last very long, as over time, as the strike ended, white workers returned to their racial prejudices after they brought black workers into the union, only really to stop them from scabbing. And this is some of that same expediency that we would have saw from Silvis, who knew that we could not actually have a functioning labor movement if a large chunk of it comes scabs every time that we strike. So the inclusion of black workers was not always a moral one. However, it was one of, again, political expediency, economic expediency, and making sure that demands were met after a strike, or during a strike, right? So these were some more newspaper articles from Solidarity, which is a newspaper from the IWW. But in Locust Point, we would see a number of strikes going on in the early 20th century. There's one in 1912, 1914, 1916, there's one in 1917. There's some even earlier, I just couldn't include it all. But within this time period, workers would strike, again, for better pay, for better working conditions. However, colored workers, black workers, Negro workers, as they would call them, were a large part of some of these strikes. And particularly, the strike in 1917 was one where we see black workers kind of taking a more militant role in striking against the industries in Locust Point and Canton as well. So this newspaper talks about black workers who stand up to police and Klansmen in Canton and in Locust Point during a strike. So about 100 black workers would have showed up to the strike to stop scabs from making their way into factories, and to stop these black workers from coming up were policemen. Right, so policemen, I think the newspaper said there was Klansmen, some other people, I'm sure some other white people were there to stop black workers from attacking the scabs. However, as one worker, black worker, John Crosby, he was told to move from the sidewalk. He said no, the policeman pushed him, and he grabbed the club from the policeman to beat him with it. And other black workers joined in. They took the revolver from the police officer, and it kind of turned out into this all-out brawl, which is why it says colored IWW men in Baltimore are gang. Because at this point, as they're trying to stop scabs from going into factories, they're trying to get them to join the union. Policemen are trying to stop them, which policemen are protectors of the state, so they're protecting property, not people. And black workers had enough, and the IWW felt that because black workers fought back, they took clubs, they took guns to policemen, they were given the respect that they needed, and they were actually able to win the demands of this strike, which was, again, I think a 25-cent raise and some other issues that were happening at these plants that needed to be addressed. But black workers and white workers in this instance would have come together again to better their own conditions, to get better wages. But even these brief moments of solidarity show that at a certain moment, race is not the most important factor for people. It is their material conditions in their lives. So again, these brief examples show how solidarity is possible in Baltimore, no matter how brief or fragile, even though many of these interracial strikes and organizations would have faded over time. In Baltimore, the possibilities of unifying the working class was never lost on the radicals in our society. And my last section I get into is really kind of what I do as a historian of communism, or the Communist Party, of the Reds in Baltimore and Maryland in the 30s and the 40s, and they're mixing with the civil rights movement and the labor movement. So this is kind of where the majority of my expertise, if you will, kind of lies. But militant groups like the IWW during the early 20th century, and even the Knights of Labor, which we didn't talk about, in the 1880s were active in organizing black and white workers. But it was radical politics that gave interracial cooperation meaning and direction. The CPUSA in Baltimore during the Great Depression was the political embodiment and culmination of the labor situation. Now, CPUSA organized black and white workers across the country, especially during the economic downturn known as the Great Depression. They led many of the struggles of the Depression era, mobilizing the unemployed, fighting against fascism, organizing industrial workers, struggling for unemployment insurance, and organizing drives and strikes that built unions. And they often explicitly did this in an interracial fashion. So they would have gained a lot of prominence among the poor and working classes, especially in Baltimore. And the Communist Party was different from many other organizations that purported to have interracial solidarity, because the Communist Party did not do this politically. They did do it politically, but not only politically and in the workplace, but socially, right? They felt that if you believe in the equality of black people in the workplace, then you should be able to party with them, they should be able to come into your home, they should be able to marry your daughter, et cetera, et cetera. So that Smash the Color Line, which is the title, actually comes from the Communist Party and them advocating for interracial marriage in the 30s and 40s. But here in Baltimore, this is a newspaper article from the Baltimore Afro-American, shows an interracial dance that draws a crowd of 400. And this dance would have been put on by the Communist Party at the Elks Hall on Madison Avenue and McMecken Street in 1929. So this is what the party is doing for workers socially, to get them to really get into that ideology of interracial solidarity and racial equality, most importantly. So the party itself would run members for its politics. For instance, James Ford would have been put on the ticket for vice president for the Communist Party about 3 times, I believe, in the 30s. And here in Baltimore, we would have some black communists who were put on the party ticket for electoral politics. And this is Samuel Parker, who would have been put on the ballot for governor in Maryland in 1930. So never before had a major political movement, especially a white one, socialist or otherwise, put a black worker, he was a longshoreman, on the ballot for electoral office. But Samuel Parker would have gotten that honor in Maryland. And also, I think they had some, I'm not sure if he was black or not, but they had some communists who also ran for mayor in Baltimore as well. But this kind of shows how the party itself not only spoke rhetorically about interracial labor, but put them in black workers in position to actually have power in the organization and outside of it as well. But never before had a movement sought to create this interracial community of workers, and that this community would have defined them politically and socially. It would have been a political duty to support black folks and their plight as working class individuals. More politics in Maryland. 4 years later, we would have had another communist candidate for a governor, and he particularly had a platform that spoke to black workers in Maryland and black people generally. He was a lawyer. He actually defended a black man named Mule Lee, who was accused of murdering a white family on the Eastern Shore. He was a communist and a part of the international, he was also a part of the international, the IWW. I'm forgetting the name all of a sudden. But he was a part of the IWW and then would have become a communist as well and ran under the Communist Party ticket in Maryland. And this particular newspaper article from the Afro talks about some of the platforms that he has, or the promises that he made to African workers, to name colored police, to repeal Jim Crow laws, to end segregation in slum areas, to open parks, pools, and golf courses to all, to pay equal wages to county school teachers, et cetera, et cetera. And this would have been how the Communist Party would have not only been socially trying to get people involved in the labor movement, but also politically involved as well. And they had to be on a platform of racial equality with black people and black workers more specifically. The last few people I want to talk about are Patrick Whalen, who was not from Baltimore. However, he organized in Baltimore with the Baltimore Soviet, and radical dock workers from the labor movement particularly organized in Baltimore because of this unique labor situation, again, where we have these white workers and these black workers. So Pat Whalen had a long history of activism, and he was also a member of the IWW before becoming a Communist Party member, and he fought for workers in Baltimore, particularly black workers, to be integrated, to have integrated facilities and an integrated union. And he would have led a march of 100+ workers, an interracial group of workers, to DC to fight for or to stop the ending of Marine workers' relief that they were getting during the Great Depression. He did not play about racism. There was a story I read about him that said that in a bar, black workers wouldn't be served, and he got up and started throwing bottles at the wall until black workers were allowed to come in and be served. So he was really down for not taking racism at any level in order to build a society that was based on racial equality. These are more pictures about Whalen and his organization and the communists. Now, his organization was the National Maritime Union, which was communist-led. It wasn't actually a Communist Party organization. They just had communists in it, and he himself was a communist. But in these pictures, we see a group of workers that are interracial, some workers picketing, and for the most part, they were advocating, of course, for better working conditions and wages, but they did so interracially, and that was the most important part of Patrick Whalen's work, which takes us back to Bethlehem Steel and Sparrows Point, where the CIO, or the Congress of Industrial Organizations, will become a very important player in organizing black and white workers at Bethlehem Steel Sparrows Point plant in Maryland, particularly in the 1930s and the 1940s. This is a picture of Bethlehem Steel in 1940s. So new organizations like the Congress of Industrial Organizations ran anti-racist trainings to facilitate black and white workers, organizing together to fight employers. It formed interracial social groups and sports teams. It challenged public displays of racism and highlighted the treatment of black workers that they faced on the job. And this is an image of some black steel workers in Sparrows Point. So Bethlehem Steel was the largest employers of blacks in this urban area. They used 5,500 blacks of total workforce. I'm reading too quick. Bethlehem used 5,500 black people in a total workforce of 16,000, and these black people would have had the lowest paying jobs. They were furnace workers in the hot pits, they were janitors throughout the plants, or they were carriers of steel to white cutters. So the surrounding towns of Dundalk and Turner Station were plagued by this racial hierarchy as well. They were plagued by severe residential segregation, and even the plant itself was segregated, with black workers relegated again to more dangerous and lower paying jobs in separate facilities such as parking lots and bathrooms. However, the company itself said that they did not do these things once they were pressured by the CIO and the Afro-American to show the plant. So this is a clipping of a newspaper article from the Afro when they went to the plant to actually find out how workers were faring, particularly black workers were faring in Sparrows Point. And this writer of this article seems pretty hesitant about what they saw. So he says things like, apparently the men work together in harmony at the plant, and the company is credited with aiding in the fostering of goodwill between the races. He found no separate toilet accommodations and made the sentiment that, from what I saw, this was not happening. But he said that the manager, whose name was Leroy C. Schlein, showed him places in the facility that weren't destitute, where workers were working together. So it seemed that the actual company was doing something for workers that it really was not. But the CIO would come in and would form a local plant at Sparrows Point. This is a very brief history of this. There was a long fight actually for a union at Sparrows Point. But in an effort to get this union in Sparrows Point, the company used spies, all type of union busting tactics to stop the CIO from actually unionizing the plant. But they themselves emphasized the needs of black workers. Again, Bethlehem Steel would have denied this discrimination, but black workers themselves knew that with the Sparrows Point, they were not getting an equal bargain as their white counterparts. But despite the efforts of the plant to prevent unionization, the CIO, which again was interracial, multiracial, successfully organized thousands of workers at the massive steel making complex. Now, this drive to establish the CIO at the Bethlehem Steel Plant, again, was the most difficult and longest, but it was the most successful CIO campaign in its history. Despite all of this, though, the company continued favoring white workers, confined black workers to the most hazardous and low-paying jobs, and invested in the white neighborhood of Dundalk and not in the black neighborhood of Turner Station. So even the workers plotting to come together and form a union that met their needs rather than those of the employers themselves were not actually willing to listen to workers. So in conclusion, in 2025, black workers are actually the most unionized group in the country, and it is essential for workers of all races, ethnicities, nationalities, genders, etc., to understand that to build an equitable world, we must organize collectively, irrespective of our perceivable differences. Race, not just class, has been a decisive factor in shaping American labor history, and the U.S. working class has developed this identity again through a culture of white supremacy, with structured labor relations, union politics, and economic opportunity. Our current economic system's capacity to accommodate cruelty and brutality is vast. So we must, as a people, if we wish to have true labor or true interracial labor solidarity, in the moments that it can exist, must confront, not ignore, racial hierarchy. Structural racism cannot be reformed away. It must be organized against collectively. Solidarity is fragile, but possible when built around shared material struggle. And it is what is required today to overcome fascism, white supremacy, and capitalism. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexis, for that fascinating talk and combining two fields of history that often aren't combined, which is labor history and black history. So I think we can start with some questions. We have some time for questions from the audience. So does anybody have any questions they would like to? Yes.
I was wondering what happened to the local labor organizations after, in the 50s, when communists were being purged from leadership positions within the union movement. Did that effort towards racial equality, fall alongside as communists were removed?
And can you repeat the question because we're recording?
Oh, that's gonna be hard to do. You asked what happened to the local labor unions after the Communist Party was kind of purged from CIO-led unions. For the most part, yes, racial issues kind of fell at the wayside, particularly even in the Communist Party itself. As World War II was happening, and they had this popular front where racial issues would take a backseat to actually having this united type of attitude around the United States. So local unions would kind of revert back to the American Federation of Labor's ideas, and they were a segregated kind of union. They put black workers were involved, but were usually in subordinated positions or face discrimination. So definitely after that period, we would see kind of race issues fall at the wayside. But this is, at that point too, we would see kind of the burgeoning of this classic civil rights movement that would have been birthed from these labor movements in the 40s and 30s later on. So yeah, these unions kind of would have went into the fold of the classic civil rights movement, but they themselves wouldn't be at the forefront of racial equality.
Anybody else? Josh?
I was impressed with how much much you fit into this talk.
Thanks.
Every time someone says I'm going to go through 100 years of history, I'm just going to cross my fingers, hoping they're going to be engaged. I was wondering, you referenced the National Maritime Union meeting hall, which I think is in Greektown, Eastern.
Yeah.
I was thinking about the two communist bookstores that have been in town in the 30s and 40s, the Free State downtown and Frederick Douglass on Druid Hill. And I was wondering if those bookstores or any other meeting spots came up in your research repeatedly, in addition to the NAU hall. Just certain meeting halls or organizing spaces, are there any addresses that kind of pop up in your research in that 30s, 40s era?
Yeah, you asked if any meeting halls outside of the NMU hall popped up in my research. Surprisingly, no. Those bookstores that you just mentioned are news to me, which is very interesting. But I didn't see any other type of social atmosphere that they would have engaged with, which I would assume there would be some. But yeah, within, because mostly I looked at, of course, pictures and newspaper articles. They mostly only mentioned this NMU hall that people gathered at in this period. But yeah, I'm definitely interested in the bookstore in the school.
So kind of along those lines, I was wondering if you know of places that held the social engagements, because there's been a series on queer history in Baltimore by a historian over the past year, and one of the things he talked about was, it was very interesting because like in a lot of black dance halls, they actually didn't enforce segregation. And so like you could have mixed race balls and stuff, and that's how a lot of Baltimore culture in like the 1920s became like cross-pollinated.
Right.
So I was just wondering, like, for the communist parties, were those happening like in those queer dance halls, or were there other spots around town?
So you asked if there were interracial dances at any queer dance halls?
Or just where? Like,
Just
what were the
where?
dances in those places?
Well, usually for Baltimore, even in, I'm gonna get to this, Baltimore, and more specifically when I looked at New York, it usually happened in these foreign language federations that had their own buildings, where they like Finnish workers, or they had like a Finnish hall. I think there was a Ukrainian like dance hall of some sort here. I don't think it's called a dance hall, it was something else. But they would have these community centers that were based around language, ethnicity, and they would host social events. And the Communist Party, in some ways, had to force all of them to accept black workers. And in my own research, that happened at a Finnish dance hall where they hosted a dance. Black workers came to it, but the Finnish workers did not want black people in their dance hall. They were pushed out, and then the Communist Party held a trial against the racist workers who pushed black folks out. So over time, especially if they were communists, they probably would have been a little nervous to not accept black people into their social settings. However, for the most part, if it was a communist type of meeting place, communist workers, it was always supposed to be integrated. But if that happened or not, kind of depends on the location. Hopefully that answered the question. Thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Well done.
Thank you.
I have 3 questions.
Ooh.
Your source materials, primary source materials, basically came from the Afro and archives. Wondering what role did the Baltimore Sun play in supplying you with information to support your. That's number 1 question.
Okay.
Number 2 question is, what's your question? You know, we start out with a research question. What was yours?
Okay.
And the 3rd question is, how much support have you been given academically and even philosophically in your process of discussing and presenting the materials to us tonight?
Okay. So the first question was, what role did the Baltimore Sun play in my archival research? It actually played a pretty big role, which isn't obvious from the slides because I didn't include any of but I kind of used the Baltimore Sun, particularly to verify information, like if something's happening in one part of Baltimore and someone's writing about, like the Solidarity wrote about this strike, I went and checked the Baltimore Sun to see if they wrote about it as well, how they compared to the Afro, and the Afro was a little more open with how they felt about these instances in the city, so I went with the Afro, because the Afro covered so much throughout history, and again, they were not shy, especially with their sympathy to communism. So I definitely relied on them for a lot more for just actual information about and sentiment behind these events. So the Baltimore Sun played a big role, but very little in the end in how I put this story together. Your second question was what was my research question? And my research question essentially was, how did the unique labor situation in Baltimore allow for interracial solidarity to happen? Because as I was stating earlier, with this large immigrant population who was coming into the city, you had the American-born white people who were here, had free black folks and enslaved black folks, and employers and capitalists utilized them in a very smart way to get profits from their labor. However, I wondered if workers were able to see that in a similar way, where they saw their situation and said, okay, despite the fact that we have these racial differences, we're being exploited by this well-organized group, we should organize ourselves. So I was just curious if workers understood their situation as well as employers and capitalists would have throughout Baltimore's history. And your third question, tell me one more time.
How much support did you get in your process of research?
Support, quite a bit, actually. I mean, a lot of this goes on in my head, but I have some fabulous scholars who help me kind of flesh out my ideas and information. Some of them are here, actually. Like I have a colleague who's a Baltimore native and an expert in Baltimore history that kind of helped me with the nuances of Baltimore. One of my professors is here, who's an archivist, and I really learned how to dig through archives and understand how these things are built to kind of flesh out the story and understand context. I have another professor here who has helped me learn has helped me in writing stories for popular audiences and really just putting in my own thoughts into it. So as far as support and putting this together, it's definitely one of community, really. I don't think I can actually tell the story without any people engage with it. So yeah.
Do those people stand up?
Oh yeah, Anthony Smooth's back there. Monica Dirksen is one of our professors. Ada Jones up here is one of my professors as well. That's the Baltimore historian and expert that helped me with the first part. Dr. Dirksen is my professor, helps me with the storytelling, and Dr. Jones is the archival expert and historian rock star that
I thought it was wonderful. I had a question on the transcripts for this Elks Lodge, because the Elks are a segregated organization, and so was this? I'm assuming this was a Black Elks Lodge.
I'm actually not sure.
Yeah, but I Googled, it's still there.
Yeah. Okay. Nice. And where is it again?
1528 Madison Avenue.
Yeah. Nice.
So yeah, I'll drive by there.
Cool. Right.
It's suitably forced.
Anything else? Oh, do you want?
Well, since Simon, I'm a unionist, and I worked in New York City, and the hierarchy of the labor movement, between majority, minority unions versus predominantly white unions, and male unions in particular versus female-dominated unions. There seems to be it seems more pronounced diversion or hierarchy within the labor movement than there was. And I'm reminded of the Teamsters president, who I think is it's essentially a labor trader. But, you know, basically is now in the bosom of the federal administration, which is the most, you know, patently anti-labor.
Right.
And so what do you make of all that, given what we've just been through?
Well, I don't really know. I have little information in that, so I won't give a full opinion on it, but I will say one of my issues with the Communist Party itself is that it becomes, over time, folded into the Democratic Party, and essentially it becomes another element of a failed electoral political system. So, I mean, I think labor movement that seeks to collaborate with the established system is frankly phony to me. However, again, I'm not sure of exactly what it is that you're saying. You probably have more information on it. You can tell us your opinion. But, yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah, I think that's about all we have time for. Just want to thank everybody for coming and thank Alexis for if you can, please fold up your chairs for us when you leave so we can help the Village Learning Place to
Labor solidarity.